Sarah Morgan had always considered herself a reasonable person. She paid her bills on time, kept her lawn maintained to community standards, and even volunteered at the local animal shelter twice a month. The last thing she expected on a quiet Tuesday afternoon was to find herself in a physical confrontation with Diane Harrington, the self-appointed queen of Willow Creek Estates. The day had started like any other. Sarah had been working from home, finalizing a project proposal due by the end of the week. Her rescue dog, Baxter, dozed peacefully at her feet as rain lightly tapped against the windows of her modest two-story home. It was the kind of peaceful productivity that made her decision to move to the suburbs feel justified despite the growing list of homeowners association complaints she'd received over the past year. At precisely 2:17 p.m., the aggressive pounding on her front door shattered the tranquility. Baxter immediately sprang up, his deep bark echoing through the house as Sarah saved her work and made her way to the entryway. "Coming," she called, peering through the peephole to see Diane Harrington standing on her porch, dressed impeccably in a powder blue pantsuit despite the drizzling rain, her silver-streaked hair pulled into a tight bun that seemed to pull her face into a permanent expression of disapproval. Sarah sighed, opening the door just enough to speak through it while keeping Baxter from charging out. "Hello, Diane. Is there something I can help you with?" "Sarah, we need to inspect your backyard immediately," Diane announced without preamble, her voice carrying the authoritative tone she perfected in her 3 years as HOA president. "We've received reports that your fence height exceeds regulation by at least 2 inches, and there are concerns about unauthorized landscaping changes." Sarah blinked, momentarily stunned. "I'm in the middle of work right now, and I didn't receive any notice about an inspection. Can we schedule this for another time?" Diane's thin lips pressed into an even thinner line. Section 7, Paragraph 3 of the HOA bylaws clearly states that the board may conduct emergency inspections with reasonable cause. Now, if you'll step aside. She attempted to push the door wider, her designer handbag swinging forward with emotion. "Wait, you can't just," Sarah began, but Diane was already attempting to wedge herself through the partially opened door, her entitled determination evident in every movement. "This is not optional, Sarah. The bylaws clearly state. The bylaws also require 24-hour written notice except in cases of imminent danger," Sarah countered, her patience rapidly evaporating. "A fence height discrepancy hardly qualifies as an emergency." Diane's face flushed with indignation. "As president of this association, I determine what constitutes an emergency. Now stand aside." Sarah felt something shift inside her. A lifetime of accommodating unreasonable demands suddenly crystallizing into firm resolve. "No, I will not let you into my home without proper notice. Please leave my property and we can discuss this through the proper channels." What happened next would later be described in the police report as an aggressive physical altercation initiated by the complainant. Diane, apparently unaccustomed to having her authority questioned, shoved her weight against the door with surprising force for a woman in her 60s. The sudden movement caught Sarah off guard, causing her to stumble backward as Diane forced her way into the foyer. Baxter, protective and startled by the intrusion, began barking furiously, circling the unwelcome visitor without making contact. Diane swung her handbag at the dog, missing him but knocking over a small table holding Sarah's keys and mail. "Get your mutt away from me," Diane shrieked, her composed HOA president persona completely evaporated. Sarah lunged forward to protect her dog, and in that moment, Diane's manicure hand flew up, her diamond tennis bracelet catching the light as her open palm connected with Sarah's cheek with a resounding slap. The sudden silence that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity. Both women stood frozen in shock, the only sound Baxter's continued growling and the gentle patter of rain outside the still-open front door. Sarah touched her stinging cheek, a strange calm settling over her as she reached for her phone on the entryway console. "What are you doing?" Diane demanded, her voice suddenly uncertain. "I'm calling the police," Sarah replied evenly, already dialing. "And I suggest you don't leave before they arrive, because this time, Diane, you've gone too far." The next 20 minutes unfolded like a scene from a neighborhood drama that Sarah never wanted a starring role in. Diane's initial shock at being reported to authorities quickly morphed into indignation, then a calculated performance of victimhood that would have impressed even the most seasoned theater critics. "You're completely overreacting," Diane insisted, pacing Sarah's foyer while maintaining a safe distance from Baxter, who had positioned himself protectively between the two women. "I barely touched you. And may I remind you that I am a respected community leader? The police will take one look at this situation and see it for what it is, a hysterical homeowner trying to avoid compliance with community standards." Sarah said nothing, her silence more powerful than any retort she could muster. She had retreated to her couch, ice pack against her cheek, documenting the reddening mark with her phone camera while keeping one eye on Diane. Years of tolerating the HOA's increasingly ridiculous demands flashed through her mind. The certified letter about her garbage bins being visible for 4 hours instead of the permitted 2, the $175 fine for planting unauthorized native wildflowers, the cease and desist regarding the bird feeder that allegedly attracted nuisance wildlife. The wail of approaching sirens cut through the tension. Diane's expression shifted, the mask of community leadership sliding perfectly back into place as she smoothed her pantsuit and adjusted her pearl earrings. "You made a terrible mistake," she said with chilling calm. "The board will not look kindly on this incident." 2 officers arrived at Sarah's door. Officer Chen, a younger woman with observant eyes that missed nothing, and Officer Ramirez, an older man whose weathered face suggested he'd seen his fair share of neighborhood disputes. They separated the women immediately, with Officer Chen speaking to Sarah in the kitchen while Officer Ramirez interviewed Diane in the living room. "Sticker saying Ms. Harrington attempted to enter your home without permission and then struck you when you tried to stop her?" Officer Chen clarified, making notes on her tablet. "Yes, I have the mark on my face and my security camera should have captured her forcing the door open," Sarah replied, pulling up the app on her phone to access the footage. "I've had problems with the HOA before, but nothing like this." In the living room, Diane's version of events was taking a dramatically different shape. "I was simply performing my duties as HOA president," Sarah overheard Diane telling Officer Ramirez, her voice carrying that perfect note of reasonable authority. Ms. Morgan became increasingly hostile when informed of potential violations. "When her dog lunged at me, I raised my arm in self-defense and she unfortunately stepped into my hand. It was entirely accidental." Sarah felt her blood pressure rising. The audacity of the lie was almost impressive. Officer Chen's expression remained neutral as she reviewed the security footage on Sarah's phone. The video clearly showed Diane pushing her way in and striking Sarah, with Baxter nowhere near either woman during the altercation. "Ms. Morgan, do you wish to press charges for assault and illegal entry?" Officer Chen asked quietly. The question hung in the air. Sarah knew the implications of her answer. Pressing charges against Diane Harrington wouldn't just be filing a police report. It would be declaring war against the HOA and the considerable social power Diane wielded in their community. Neighbors would take sides. The board would likely retaliate with increased scrutiny of every aspect of Sarah's property. Yet the alternative, allowing Diane to continue her reign of entitled tyranny, suddenly seemed unthinkable. "Yes," Sarah said firmly, "I want to press charges." The words seemed to echo through the house. In the living room, Diane fell silent mid-sentence, her finely tuned social antenna picking up the shift in atmosphere. She emerged into the hallway, face a perfect mask of concern and confusion. "Surely we can resolve this misunderstanding without formal charges," she suggested, the subtle threat beneath her reasonable tone evident only to Sarah. "After all, we're neighbors." Officer Ramirez stepped forward. "Ma'am, I've reviewed the security footage Ms. Morgan provided. Your account of events doesn't align with what the video shows." The color drained from Diane's face. She clearly hadn't anticipated the existence of video evidence. There must be some mistake. The angle must be misleading." "The angle shows you striking Ms. Morgan quite clearly," Officer Chen replied evenly. "Ms. Harrington, please place your hands behind your back. You're being placed under arrest for assault and illegal entry." The following morning, Sarah awoke to her phone buzzing incessantly with notifications. News of Diane's arrest had spread through Willow Creek Estates with the efficiency of a well-oiled gossip machine. The community Facebook group, normally reserved for lost pet announcements and complimentary handyman recommendations, had exploded with speculative posts and thinly veiled references to recent unfortunate incidents within our leadership. Sarah scrolled through the messages with growing unease. There were dozens of texts from neighbors, some expressing support, others requesting the real story, and a few barely concealed criticisms suggesting she had overreacted. Most concerning was an email from Gerald Thompson, HOA Vice President and Diane's most loyal ally, calling for an emergency board meeting that evening to address recent community disturbances. "They're circling the wagons," Sarah muttered to Baxter, who wagged his tail in response to her voice without understanding the gravity of the situation. Her doorbell rang at precisely 10:15 a.m. Sarah approached cautiously, checking the security camera first, a habit she was grateful to have established. Standing on her porch was Margaret Chen, a retired high school principal who lived 3 doors down and had always exchanged friendly waves with Sarah without ever engaging in deeper conversation. "Good morning," Sarah said, opening the door while keeping a firm grip on Baxter's collar. "Can I help you?" Margaret's expression was unreadable behind her oversized sunglasses. "May I come in? I think we need to talk." Sarah hesitated, yesterday's events still fresh in her mind. "I hope you understand if I'm a bit cautious about letting people into my home right now." A hint of a smile crossed Margaret's face, completely understandable. Perhaps we could speak on your back patio. I believe what I have to say will interest you." 20 minutes later, seated across from Margaret at her patio table, Sarah was struggling to process what she was hearing. "So you're telling me that Diane has been selectively enforcing HOA rules for years? That she's been waiving violations for her friends while aggressively pursuing others?" Sarah asked, trying to keep the disbelief from her voice. Margaret removed her sunglasses, her dark eyes sharp with intelligence. "I'm telling you that's just the beginning. The financial audit I requested last year mysteriously disappeared. 3 board members who questioned her decisions suddenly found themselves facing trumped-up violations that would have cost thousands to address. The landscaping company that maintains our common areas is owned by her brother-in-law. But why is no one saying anything? Why hasn't this been brought up at meetings?" Margaret's laugh was bitter. Because Diane scheduled meetings when working people couldn't attend. Because she cultivated a loyal following of retirees who benefit from her selective enforcement. Because anyone who spoke up found themselves socially isolated or worse. Sarah leaned back, processing this information. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because you did what none of us had the courage to do. You stood up to her, and you have proof of her true nature." Margaret placed a thick folder on the table between them. "This is documentation I've been collecting for over 2 years. Bank statements showing questionable transfers from the HOA account. Email chains where she coordinated targeted enforcement against homeowners who challenged her. A list of 14 residents who sold their homes in the past 18 months, all after clashing with Diane." Sarah stared at the folder, its innocuous manila exterior belying the explosive contents within. "What do you expect me to do with this?" "The emergency meeting tonight isn't about addressing community disturbances," Margaret said gravely. "It's about damage control. They're going to vote to use HOA funds for Diane's legal defense. They're going to paint you as unstable and vindictive. And then they're going to begin making your life so miserable that you'll have no choice but to move." A chill ran through Sarah despite the warm spring day. "They can't do that. They can, and they will, unless we stop them." Margaret's eyes held a determined gleam. "There are others, Sarah. Other homeowners who've been waiting for an opportunity to reclaim our community. Your security footage was the crack in Diane's armor we've been waiting for." "What exactly are you proposing?" "We attend the emergency meeting tonight. All of us. We bring copies of this documentation. We call for an immediate vote of no confidence in the entire board." Margaret's voice dropped. "We take back our neighborhood." As Margaret outlined her plan, Sarah felt a strange mix of dread and exhilaration. She had never intended to become the face of a neighborhood revolt. All she had wanted was to be left alone, to live peacefully in the Willow Creek Estates Community Center was designed to accommodate 30 people comfortably. By 6:45 p.m., over 70 residents had packed into the room, creating a buzz of anticipation that bordered on electric. Sarah stood near the back entrance with Margaret, watching as Gerald Thompson and the remaining board members huddled at the front table, their concerned whispers and darting glances betraying their unease at the unprecedented turnout. "They're panicking," Margaret observed, a note of satisfaction in her voice. Gerald expected his usual crowd of cronies, not half the neighborhood. Sarah nodded, trying to quell the anxiety churning in her stomach. The documentation Margaret had provided was now safely backed up on 3 different devices and shared with trusted allies. Copies had been made for distribution, and a PowerPoint presentation was ready on a USB drive. The case against Diane and her enablers was meticulously prepared. Yet doubts still nagged at her. What if they refuse to listen? What if they shut the meeting down before we can present anything? "That's why timing is everything," Margaret replied calmly, "and why we have Plan B." At precisely 7:00 p.m., Gerald Thompson called the meeting to order, his usual practiced smile strained at the edges. "Thank you all for coming to this emergency session," he began, scanning the crowded room. "While we appreciate community engagement, I must remind everyone that only board members may speak during the business portion of our agenda. We'll open the floor for brief comments at the end if time permits." A murmur of disapproval rippled through the crowd. "Our first order of business concerns the unfortunate incident involving our board president, Diane Harrington," Gerald continued, his voice taking on a rehearsed quality. "As many of you know, Diane was involved in a regrettable misunderstanding yesterday that resulted in unfounded legal accusations." Sarah felt her face flush with anger at the characterization. Margaret placed a restraining hand on her arm. "Not yet," she whispered. "Let him dig the hole deeper. The board proposed allocating funds from our legal reserves to ensure proper representation for Ms. Harrington," Gerald stated, rushing through the words. "We'll now take a vote among board members." "Point of order," called a voice from the middle of the room. Edward Michaels, a retired attorney who lived on Maple Lane, stood up with a copy of the HOA bylaws in hand. Section 12, paragraph 4 clearly states that any emergency allocation exceeding $5,000 requires a general membership vote, not just board approval. Gerald's smile faltered. This is a standard legal defense allocation that falls within board discretion. How much is being allocated? Edward pressed. $20,000. But the room erupted in outrage. Gerald banged his gavel repeatedly, struggling to regain control of the meeting. $20,000 of our dues to defend someone who trespassed and assaulted a homeowner. A woman near the front shouted, "We've seen the video." Gerald blanched. What video? Sarah stepped forward, her heart pounding. The security footage from my front door camera showing Diane forcing her way into my home and striking me when I asked her to leave. That footage is part of an ongoing legal matter and is not appropriate for discussion here, Gerald countered. Actually, Margaret said, striding to the front of the room with the confidence of someone who had commanded classrooms for decades, since you're proposing to use our money to defend actions we haven't even seen, it's entirely appropriate. She plugged a thumb drive into the laptop connected to the room's projector. Before we vote on spending $20,000, perhaps we should all know exactly what we're defending. Before Gerald could object, the footage began playing on the large screen. The room fell silent as they watched Diane's entitled demand for entry, her physical forcing of the door, and the clear, unmistakable moment when she struck Sarah across the face. Where the video ended, the silence lingered for several heartbeats before erupting into angry voices. "Order! I will have order!" Gerald shouted, banging his gavel with increasing desperation. Margaret seized the moment. "I move to immediately suspend the current board pending a full financial and procedural audit of HOA operations." "I second," Edward called out. "You can't do this," Gerald sputtered. "This isn't on the agenda." Section 8, Paragraph 7, Edward replied, his legal training evident in his methodical tone. "Members may bring emergency motions from the floor when they concern matters of community welfare or potential malfeasance." The morning of Diane's court appearance dawned bright and clear, a stark contrast to the storm of tension still swirling through Willow Creek Estates. Sarah had barely slept, the threatening text message replaying in her mind throughout the night. She had forwarded it to Officer Chen, who advised documenting any further communications but admitted there was little they could do about a single vague message. Sarah, dressed carefully in a conservative navy pantsuit, wanting to project composure and credibility in the courtroom. As she fed Baxter and prepared to leave, her doorbell rang. Through the security camera, she saw Margaret and Edward waiting on her porch, both similarly dressed for court. "We thought you might appreciate some company," Margaret explained when Sarah opened the door. "No one should have to face this alone." The gratitude Sarah felt was overwhelming. A week ago, she had been a virtual stranger to these people. Now they were her strongest allies. The courthouse was busier than Sarah had expected, with a small cluster of Willow Creek residents already gathered outside the designated courtroom. Some offered supportive nods. Others averted their eyes. The neighborhood's divide was still evident even here. Diane arrived with her attorney, a polished man in an expensive suit who exuded confidence. She walked past Sarah without acknowledgement, her face a practiced mask of dignified suffering. Only the tightness around her eyes betrayed her fury. Inside the courtroom, the proceedings moved with an efficiency that caught Sarah by surprise. Diane had been charged with simple assault and criminal trespass. Her attorney presented a motion to dismiss, arguing that as HOA president, Diane had legitimate reason to believe she had authority to enter the property. The judge, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s, reviewed the security footage in silence, her expression growing increasingly severe. "Ms. Harrington," she finally said, looking over her reading glasses, "regardless of your position as HOA president, the bylaws you submitted as evidence clearly state that except in cases of imminent danger, 24-hour written notice is required. Furthermore, nothing in these bylaws grants you authority to strike a homeowner under any circumstances." Diane's attorney attempted to interject, but the judge silenced him with a raised hand. "The footage is unambiguous. The motion to dismiss is denied. How does your client plead?" After a hushed consultation with her attorney, Diane stood, chin raised defiantly. "Not guilty, Your Honor." The judge set a trial date and moved on to discussing bail conditions. The defendant will have no contact, direct or indirect, with the victim. This includes electronic communications, phone calls, and physical proximity. You are to maintain a distance of at least 100 yards from Ms. Morgan's property and person. Sarah felt a wave of relief at these conditions, which addressed her immediate safety concerns. As the hearing concluded, Officer Chen approached her in the hallway. "I wanted you to know we're taking the text message seriously," she said quietly. "We can't prove it came from Ms. Harrington yet, but we've documented it in relation to this case. If you receive any more, or if there are any attempts to violate the no-contact order, call us immediately." Outside the courthouse, Diane was holding an impromptu press conference with a local reporter. Sarah paused at the top of the steps, surprised to see media interest in her neighborhood dispute. "This is a shameful example of our justice system being manipulated," Diane was saying, her voice carrying across the plaza. A dedicated community volunteer with an unblemished record is being criminalized for performing her duties. The security footage has been selectively edited to misrepresent what actually occurred. Sarah felt her face flush with anger at the blatant lie. The unedited footage had been reviewed by police, the prosecutor, and now the judge. Margaret placed a steadying hand on her arm. "Don't engage. She's hoping you'll make a scene that the reporter can capture." They were almost to Sarah's car when Gerald Thompson stepped into their path. "This has gone far enough," he said, his usual patronizing tone tinged with desperation. "You've made your point. The board is willing to negotiate. We can make all this go away." Edward stepped forward. "Make what go away, Gerald? The assault charges, the financial improprieties, the discriminatory enforcement practices, all of which are now matters of public record. You're destroying our property values with this circus," Gerald hissed. "Is that what you want? For all our homes to be worth less because you couldn't handle a simple HOA violation?"